I'll be talking about inequality, as Adam outlined. Particularly, I'll be talking about two questions. What are the implications of continued low productivity growth for inequality? And I'll be summarizing in this section the implications from the work that Larry Summers and I did and the work that Jason Furman and Peter Orszag did in the book we're launching today. And then, how should these affect our policy decisions on inequality? So to start with the implications. Arguably, the defining fact of inequality in the US in the last 4 or 5 decades is the decline in the relative incomes of typical workers. This is one way to illustrate it. You can see that median and production and non-supervisory workers' pay has grown much more slowly relative to labor productivity. A natural question that this graph might suggest is, does productivity growth still benefit typical workers? And that is the premise under which Larry Summers and I wrote our paper. This graph illustrates our results. It shows that despite labor productivity having diverged from typical workers' pay in levels, in fact, the growth rates are very closely linked. You can see that in periods of higher productivity growth, there's substantially higher pay growth for typical workers. Numerically, we estimate that about 1% higher productivity growth corresponds to about 0.5% to 1% higher pay growth for median and production and non-supervisory workers. The general takeaway is positive. Productivity growth still passes through to typical workers' pay. But the takeaway for this particular session is not positive. If we're assuming that we'll be in a future of low productivity growth, that implies we'll also be in a future of lower pay growth for typical workers. In fact, if you apply the estimates that we have in our paper, and you have 1% a year labor productivity growth, which is about what we've seen in the last decade, that would imply likely pay stagnation, no growth in real terms in pay for typical workers. Jason Furman and Peter Orszag's paper posits a common cause for the decline in productivity growth and the rise in inequality. They argue that reduced competition and dynamism is characterizing recent years in the US economy. They document a declining entry rate of firms, declining job creation, declining labor mobility, declining success of young firms. They document rises in industrial concentration, and they document an increased dispersion in the success of firms, with the most profitable firms pulling rapidly away from the rest. All of these facts, they argue, are compatible with a decline in competition in the US economy, which, by leading to less investment and less innovation, would result in lower productivity growth and would also result in rising inequality. So to take the implication for the future, if reduced competition and dynamism continue, then we can expect both lower productivity growth and faster rising inequality. So not particularly cheery implications. Low productivity growth implies slow growing or stagnant pay for typical workers, likely faster rising inequality, and less total resources to distribute. It's worth noting that fast productivity growth would not have solved the inequality problems that we face, but it would have given us much more to work with. So I'll take these implications, and I've put together 5 principles of inequality policy in an era of low productivity growth. These principles are not meant to be hard and fast rules about what policymakers should do. Rather, they're meant to be directional. So taking your set of policy preferences around inequality as given, how should you adjust them? In which direction should you move if you think that we'll be in a world of really slow productivity growth? I'll argue first that productivity growth should be a particular priority even when we're thinking about policies to reduce inequality, and that there are a number of double dividend policies which can both improve on both margins. Since resource constraints will bind more tightly, I'll argue that we have to be realistic that hard choices about redistribution will have to be made, and that it should weigh in favor of targeted benefits over universal benefits. And finally, that multiple policy levers should be used, specifically focusing on pre-distribution, not just redistribution, and focusing particularly on dignity, justice, and other measures of non-monetary well-being alongside monetary outcomes. Let's start with principle 1, double dividend policies. Now, it's common in economic policy to have a trade-off between efficiency and equity. But actually, there are a number of policies in today's economy which could result in improvements on both margins. They can reduce inequality and increase productivity growth. Since we know that productivity growth is important in raising the pay of typical workers, and we know that there are vast proportions of society who are excluded from opportunities to fulfill their talent and their potential, that is the first bucket of policies on which we can improve on both margins. Reducing barriers to workforce participation, particularly through criminal justice reform, which will reduce the proportion of people, particularly of African American men who are incarcerated, predominantly for minor offences, would not only enable people to rejoin the labour force, but also to enter the kind of jobs at which they can fulfil their productive potential more. Paid parental leave and childcare support similarly enable women to re-enter the workforce and to enter the jobs at which they can fulfill their productive potential. Reducing barriers to labour mobility can increase dynamism. For example, ensuring that workers don't lose their health benefits when they leave their jobs, reducing occupational licensing requirements or land use restrictions that mean that workers can't move into the occupations or the cities at which they would be most productive. Increasing access to education, somewhat obviously, but important to emphasize, particularly access to quality schools in disadvantaged neighborhoods and early childhood education. And increasing competition, increasing antitrust enforcement and ensuring that barriers to entry for new firms are not too high. Now, Adam said at the beginning of this session that we are looking to adapt and not to mitigate. So I appreciate these are a little bit cheeky because I'm arguing that we can actually improve the rate of productivity growth and reduce inequality. For the next 4 principles, I instead will focus just on adaptation. We're going to take the rate of productivity growth as given and work with that. And that leads to my second principle. We need to accept that hard choices about redistribution must be made. It's somewhat trite to observe that in a world of lower productivity growth, we'll have fewer resources, but I think the magnitude is worth dwelling on. Let's compare 2 rates of labour productivity growth. 2.5% a year is the rate the US saw in the 50s and 60s, or in the late 90s and early 2000s. 1% a year is what we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years. In the high productivity growth world, over 10 years, total national income grows by more than a quarter. In the low productivity world, total national income grows by about 1/10. What does this imply for our capacity to redistribute? Currently, if you look at the post-tax and transfer distribution of national income, as calculated by Piketty, Sayers, and Zuckman recently, the bottom 50% of the income distribution receive about 19–20% of national income. Let's take a very simple hypothetical of what our goal might be in tackling inequality. We want to reverse the rise in inequality for the bottom 50%, which implies bringing their income share back to 25% of total national income, what it was in the 1960s, 1970s. Assuming we could redistribute perfectly, take the whole amount of national income in 2029 in the high productivity growth world. Allocate a quarter of it to the bottom 50% of the income distribution. How much is left over? One scenario is if you hold constant the incomes of the top 10%, the middle 50th to 90th percentile can still see 3% a year income growth, coincidentally reverting them back also to their income shares of the 1970s, so fully reversing the rise in income share inequality over that period. In contrast, if we do the same in the world of low productivity growth, what happens? We give 25% of the income share of the national income in 2029 to the bottom 50% of the income distribution. That essentially means that the other half of the income distribution have to see no real income growth over 10 years. Basically, the point is that if we are serious about doing a lot to reverse the rise in inequality, if we're in a world of low productivity growth, we're going to have to make seriously hard choices about freezing or actually cutting living standards for parts of the income distribution. Resource constraints also point towards favoring targeted benefits over universal benefits, principle number 3. There's been a lot of discussion of universal basic income, universal minimum inheritances, as policy responses to automation, where there's mass productivity growth, but also mass job displacement. We're actually thinking about a very different world, a world in which productivity growth is very slow. So we have very few resources to redistribute. Nonetheless, we have an inequality issue. Regardless of your innate preferences between a universal and a targeted policy, which may be to do with issues like political feasibility or the nature of the social contract, it's incontrovertible that in a world with fewer resources, some more weight should be placed on targeted policies, which can achieve the same income redistribution goals at a lower resource cost. Policy number 4, I'll argue that we should promote predistribution and not just redistribution. Predistribution is the idea that rather than just using the tax and transfer system to correct for inequalities in market income, you can actually do something to adjust the inequalities in market income directly. And I'll speak specifically today about policies that increase worker bargaining power, either through collective bargaining institutions or institutions that increase worker involvement in corporate governance and corporate decision-making. Why is this particularly important in a world of low productivity growth? It's particularly important, I think, in this particular world of low productivity growth that we find ourselves in. As I argued earlier, we can't rely on productivity growth to raise workers' pay on its own, judging by the estimates from Larry Summers in my paper. Similarly, as I've noted and as Karen laid out but in much great detail, fiscal redistribution is going to be more difficult. The scope for fiscal policy is going to be much narrower to redistribute through taxes and transfers. That means if you're serious about tackling inequality, really, you have to do something about the root causes. And a great deal of research is increasingly arguing that the root causes of this rising inequality is a decline in worker bargaining power, or at least one of the root causes. In addition, if there has been this rise in market concentration and decline in competition, it may actually not involve too much of a trade-off to increase worker bargaining power. By increasing the countervailing power of workers against the rising power of corporations, you might be able to increase efficiency, or at least not harm it too much. And my final principle, for which I don't have a nice graph or picture, is that we should be sure to focus on dignity and justice alongside monetary outcomes. For a given financial cost or monetary benefit of a policy, it can either enhance or diminish the dignity and self-esteem of the beneficiaries, and it can either tackle systemic injustice or ignore it. I think, and many others I know in this room, think that it's important to focus on dignity and justice and these other aspects of non-monetary well-being in any world, but particularly in a world of low productivity growth, where we're going to have much more of a difficult time achieving our goals for reducing inequality in monetary income. It makes it much more important to do all that we can to ensure that all of our policies promote dignity, self-esteem, justice, and these other aspects of non-monetary well-being that we care about. So that's all that I have, and I look forward to the discussion.